I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to the Halloween episode of Knock Once for Yes. It's the most wonderful time of the year, that precious month when the whole world seems to embrace the ghosties and the ghoulies almost as much as we do all year round.
It's also the very first birthday of Knock Once for Yes.
Woo!
I suggested a coffee cake, but Lil said it was too cheesy. I suggested a cheesecake, and she just looked at me with a stern face.
Bearing in mind, neither of us can eat cake. But we've had a fantastic first year, thanks to all our listeners and story contributors. It's been a wild ride, and I hope it's the first of many to come.
Coming up on today's episode, we've got a haunted top 10 on the Paranormal Radar. We've got lots of spooky stories from our listeners, and we're going to talk to you about the time we lived in a very haunted house.
But first, we'd like to thank our latest patrons: Jessica from Toronto,
John Sheridan,
Alan Tigwell,
Annie Caradio,
Justin Henderson,
and Raymond Gregan, stalwart of our Facebook group.
Thank you so much, guys, and a huge thank to all our patrons. We are entirely listener supported, and you wonderful people literally make this show possible.
And so on to our Paranormal Radar story. Being that time of year, all the publications are coming out with their token Halloween or spooky stories, and getting in on the act are English Heritage, who have decided to publish their top 10 spookiest sites as voted for by their 1800 staff. Featuring on the list is Dover Castle in Kent, where I visited as a younger chap. Not that I noticed anything spooky at the time, unfortunately. Also there is Whitby Abbey in North Yorkshire, where I believe you've been there.
I have, rather shamefully. I think it's the only place on this list that I've actually been to. But Whitby Abbey's fantastic. I'd love to go back. I went as quite a younger child, and it was quite spooky though.
We'll have to pay a visit and send our listeners a paranormal postcard.
I think we will.
There's also Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire, which isn't too far away from us, so with luck we'll get to visit that at some point. But the number one spookiest site as voted for by English Heritage,
drumroll please,
is Bolsover Castle. Located in Derbyshire, the former home of William Cavendish was built in the 17th century on top of the site of a medieval castle, and is one of the most widely reported haunted sites in the care of English Heritage. Reports from staff and visitors include being pushed, pinched, having doors slammed on them, and finding objects inexplicably moved. Security guards said they've seen unexplained lights at the castle, and one woman claims she heard a scream as she was locking up, only to find no one there. Some visitors have even reported seeing William himself wandering the lonely corridors. Lucy Hutchings, regional director of English Heritage, said, "Our sites are soaked in history, and from bloody battles to dark deeds, not all of their stories are sweetness and light. Our castles and palaces, especially on these Halloween nights, can be eerie places, and some of our team have seen and heard things they can't easily explain. It's no wonder that it's been voted English Heritage's spookiest site."
Well, not to be outdone, the National Trust have released their own list of top haunted places, only they've decided to go one better and do 11.
Who does a top 11?
Right. Obviously the National Trust do.
For those overseas, English Heritage and the National Trust are UK charitable organisations who look after our heritage buildings, places of historic interest and national beauty.
And on their top 11, not 10, list of haunted places feature places like Corfe Castle in Dorset, the former home of Sir Winston Churchill, which I'd never heard about and didn't know was haunted, so that was interesting, and the Treasurer's House in Yorkshire, which we've talked about on one of our Patreon episodes, where the ghosts of Roman soldiers have appeared. But the one that caught my eye particularly was Felbrigg Hall in Norfolk. When we first started doing the paranormal postcards, I talked about how finding the ghosts in historic buildings was somewhat of a family holiday pastime for me. And on one such site, I became convinced there was a ghost in the library, which, of course, my intrepid mum decided to announce to the entire room, thoroughly freaking out the guide, but he did confirm that the stories of the hauntings in that house did centre around the library, and the look on his face was pretty priceless. But I've never really looked it up, and I've never really had any sort of confirmation that I only had the word of the guide to go on. I never really looked into it. It was only a few months ago I was talking to my mum about it, and she remembered that it was Felbrigg Hall that this happened at. So, of course, when this popped up on the National Trust's list of top haunted places, I was pretty fascinated. And as it turns out, there is a bit of a backstory. So Felbrigg Hall is a 17th century Grade 1 listed stately home in Norfolk. Between 1752 and 1755, William Wyndham II converted the Jacobean Great Chamber of the house into a Gothic library. The collection contains approximately 5,000 books, the oldest of which dates back to 1509, and it's this library that's the setting for the hall's ghost stories, featuring not the library's creator, but his descendant. William Wyndham III inherited Felbrigg Hall in 1749, and he loved books. In fact, he loved them so much, he died trying to save a library. In July of 1809, Wyndham had been visiting a friend in London when he spotted a house fire on Conduit Street. He knew his friend Frederick North kept a valuable library in a house a few doors down from the burning building, and he rushed in to try to save the books from the fire. With help, he succeeded in saving most of the books before the fire reached the house, but whilst removing some heavy books, he took a bad fall and injured his hip. The injury never really healed and eventually required surgery, which was not the safest undertaking in the 1800s. The surgery had seemed to be a success, but unfortunately, he never recovered from the shock of the procedure and died not long after in 1810. According to witnesses, however, he still likes to visit the magnificent library at Felbrigg Hall, catching up on reading all the books he didn't have time to finish during his life. Staff and volunteers report seeing William sitting at the library table or relaxing in a library chair, although there is a claim that his ghost will only appear when a particular combination of books is placed on the library table.
So, spidey senses on form then?
Absolutely. I had no idea, because obviously this information wasn't sort of out in the house at the time. And the only reason I've never looked it up was because you know how terrible my memory was, and I couldn't actually remember where it was that we were. It was literally a couple of months ago I was talking to my mum about it, and then this list was released, so it kind of blew me away a bit, actually.
Can't believe it took you a decade to do your research.
I know!
Also, there's a couple of points there. First of all, William Wyndham, man after my own heart.
Oh, mine too.
Obviously, we're both big readers, and I could appreciate... I don't think I'd have rushed into a burning building to save books, but I'd have been tempted.
Yeah.
And when you were first telling me this story, I must admit, I did assume that he was going to have died in the fire.
No.
Especially when you said, he had a fall and injured, and I thought, he was caught crawling to the door, books in hand, choking on smoke.
Not
so yeah,
quite.
it's a shame about the surgery, obviously.
Yeah.
And super geek that I am, I also like the story that placing the combination of books on the table will summon the ghost.
I know.
It's kind of like a computer game.
Yeah.
You have correctly placed the 3 books on the table and summoned the ghost of William Wyndham. Your quest is complete. 500 ghost hunting XP.
You nerd. We'll be putting these lists up in the show notes and on the Facebook so you can have a look for yourselves. Maybe you have visited one of the top 10 or top 11 haunted places.
Moving on from our Paranormal Radar story, we've got lots of spooky stories coming up from our listeners. But first, we wanted to speak to you about our very haunted house.
Yes, we've shared quite a lot of our personal stories on the show already, but we've never quite got around to telling you about the time we lived in a particularly haunted house, the most haunted house so far that we've ever lived in. And there's quite a lot of tales to tell, so we'll be dipping in and out of that throughout the episode. But first off, we wanted to give you a little bit of context. Now, this was the first house that Fitz and I had lived in together, and we hadn't really been going out that long, actually, so you can kind of understand why it really cemented our relationship quite firmly in the paranormal.
Funnily enough, it was one of the things that came up on our first date that kind of got me through the door, so to speak. Lil happened to mention that she lived in a haunted house, and I obviously took it well enough That it was acceptance that she wasn't a crazy loon.
Well, basically, I said to Fitz, I think I live in a haunted house. And when he replied, oh, so do I, I knew it was meant to be. Now, we weren't the only ones living in the house. This was a big 3-storey Victorian townhouse, and it was a shared living arrangement, a bit like a student house, only we were all a bit too old to be students, but too poor to be renting alone. And I think it's fair to say that everybody in that house had their own spooky experiences. So to bring you the full story, we rounded up our old roomies, also known as the band Starforger, and sat down with them to discuss what happened. We're going to bring you a bit of that conversation now. We're here today with Rob and Fraser from Starforger. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Starforger, guys?
Yes, we're a symphonic death metal band that write really nerdy music that's largely based around video games.
Nice.
And we know you guys personally, obviously.
And more to the point, when we lived in our very haunted house, Rob, Fraser and I were all in a band together, so we spent a lot of time hanging out in that house. So, Rob, it was you that told me that there was stuff that was going on there in the first place. What was the first thing that happened?
It just felt really strange. It's difficult to say, really. No, I just always felt uncomfortable in certain areas of the house, especially around the cellar door.
Oh, yeah. The cellar.
I could never go into the cellar by myself. Well, I say that. I did eventually.
Yeah.
Plucked up the courage. But yeah, there were certain areas on the stairs as well, on the middle landing, where late at night it always seemed like somebody was running past the bathroom.
Yeah, something I experienced as well. And this is really interesting for me, because despite having lived there together for quite some time and all experiencing these things, we've never actually just sat down and like compared experiences. Certainly not since we all moved out. So I don't think I even realised that you had that something running past the bathroom experience, because we both experienced that, didn't we?
I had that a lot.
That was a common theme, actually, throughout the house, wasn't it? I've heard that story about like three or four different times from different people.
From all different people?
From people that stayed at the house and told me about, like, watch out when you go to the bathroom, because, you know, I see stuff moving past the glass. There was frosted glass in this bathroom, I should point out.
Yeah, it was the worst bathroom door ever. Obviously the bottom half was wood, but it had this big window in it with frosted glass. So if somebody did walk past, you could see the shape and form of something going past at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was dreadful.
I mean, it was a house full of kind of people who were generally up and down during the night anyway. So, like, sometimes it would just be people, but often it wasn't.
Well, the other thing to that is that it was all adults living in that house, and quite, you know, reasonably tall adults. Yeah, and I don't know about you, but when I saw something going past that glass, it was child size.
Yeah, blonde pigtails.
And there was definitely no... Oh, is that what you saw?
Yeah.
See, I only saw her through the bathroom window as a shadow, like a fleeting... It was so quick, like I couldn't see detail.
I saw it coming up the stairs. That was the one.
I didn't realise that you'd seen it coming up the stairs, because I swear someone else had seen her coming up the stairs as well.
Oh.
I've definitely heard that one before. There's someone met her on the staircase.
Just to give some context, Fraser didn't actually live in the house or have any experience.
No,
he's just here because he's got a good memory.
Yeah.
And to be fair, he hung around there a lot.
One experience.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
We'll get to that. Oh, so go on then. Give a description of the little girl that you saw and see how it measures up to Fitz's.
It was kind of a fleeting image. I was on the toilet, facing the door, as you would be.
As you would be.
And yeah, it was just like a quick flash going past the window, and I don't know, it must have been probably up to, say, my stomach, kind of that sort of height, maybe just over 4 feet.
Definitely child
definitely
size.
blonde.
Nobody was that short in that house.
Nobody was blonde.
No.
Because what I saw was something coming up the stairs, and like Rob, it was fleeting, because I just felt, I'd come up the stairs and I just kind of felt something behind me and looked behind and just caught a flash of blonde and like an arm on the rail, and that was enough. I was gone. I was upstairs again.
I'll tell you what, I always used to run up those stairs. You couldn't, I don't think anybody could. I don't know anybody that could actually walk up those stairs. There was just something wrong about them. They were so creepy, and I'd just run. And bearing in mind, this is a 3-storey house. This is like a Victorian townhouse, so there was quite a few flights of stairs to run up, and they were all as creepy as each other.
Do you reckon that's because it's directly over the cellar?
The stairwell.
The stairwell is directly over the cellar door. That's how you get to the cellar.
I didn't even think about
I hadn't
that.
until just now, but you open the door underneath the stairs, don't you? It's one of those things, like an understair cupboard that goes down another flight of stairs to the cellar. It's like directly over the top. It's like a lid, essentially, on the cellar, isn't it?
I made that connection.
You're walking over this big gaping maw that goes down to the creepy cellar.
Yeah, because one of my first experiences was in the cellar, which we'll get to later. But did you have any experiences in the cellar? Because, well, at this point, I'll say, before I moved into the house, Rob, because we were in a band, we had some recording equipment. Rob, wisely or unwisely, I'm not sure, decided to record in the cellar overnight with a microphone set up. Just left it recording to see what he would catch. And what he caught was pretty terrifying. But what made you think to do that in the first place?
It was mainly because when I moved in, I was kind of curious about what was in the cellar, and just the door creeped me out anyway.
Yeah.
When I opened it, it was like lots of really skinny legs just pulled back away from the light as it went in the door.
Oh, but do you know what? That fits in with our skitterers, isn't it?
Yeah, that was literally just skittering kind of legs.
Oh God.
And it took me quite a while to pluck up the courage to go down there.
Yeah.
But when I did, I wouldn't say we got any like spectacular EVPs or anything like that. Just strange knocking bumps and a weird little breath.
Yeah, I know. I sat and listened to it after. Again, like I said, this is before I was living there. And the breath, it was obviously there was nobody down there, and it was interesting because you could hear the noises of the house for a while. Obviously, the recording was quite long, so you got used to like the ambient house noises. As you were listening to it, you could hear like cars passing outside the basement, and you could hear after Rob had obviously set up the recording equipment, you could hear him walk up all the flights of stairs, so you could tell the different sounds for when people were walking on different steps. And obviously this went on for hours and hours until sort of it got to the middle of the night and all the sort of house noises had pretty much died down. And then, well, there was a few different noises. There was a noise that sounded like something being dragged, and it very much sounded like it was in the basement.
Yeah, it was all so close to the microphone.
Exactly, and if you work with microphones like we all have here over the years, you can hear when something is that close. Something tapped the microphone at one point, I'm pretty sure, and it was again directly on the mic.
It did it a couple of times. I remember that was. I listened to this as well straight after you did it. I think I was round
In the house.
Yeah,
in the house.
I was in it. Yeah, I remember you delightedly showing me this and watching my expression
And did you have
as
to
you
sleep
did.
there that night?
I did have to sleep there that night. Yes, and that was the thing that chilled me the most. There was a lot of really creepy stuff on there, but that touching of the mic, because it happened again a little bit after, like a few minutes afterwards.
Right.
It was like two touches of the mic. I very distinctly remember.
It was the breath into the microphone that got me, because again it was like a huff.
It sounded like a breath.
Mm.
I don't know that it was a breath.
No.
It's kind of hard to tell. It could have been just. I don't even know what it could have been. It
Draft.
could have been a breath.
But again, because we're used to working with audio, that's exactly what it sounded like. But like you say, there are other explanations. The other thing that really creeped me out in the recording was that there was some knocks, and again they did sound like they were within the basement. And was it 4 at first, and it literally sounded like on wood or something a bit reverberatey. But then there was nothing for a while, and then it happened again, but there was like one more knock, and then there was nothing for a while, and the next time it happened there was again one more knock than the last time, and it kept increasing. And I was just like, well, that's not a house noise, because if it was something organic or something that was just happening naturally, it would be the same number. You wouldn't have an increasing number of knocks. It was just a very strange thing to happen. So there we go, and we'll hear some more of their experiences later on. But first, as a listener, I'm very aware that my first question at this point would be, have you still got the recording? And before you ask, we have asked Rob to try and look for it. But bear in mind this was over 11 years ago now, and I think it was actually recorded on mini disc. He is still searching for it, and if he does find it, we will of course bring it to you.
While we're discussing recording, just a little side note, you could tell from the recording there that there was a lot of room noise. That's because we were sat quite far back from the microphones to get everybody on. We're now speaking quite close to the microphones, so you should have an idea of how easy it is to tell sort of distance from a microphone in regards to the breath.
While we're talking about the creepy basement, that was the setting for the first thing that happened to me after moving into the house. I was actually moving in my furniture and decided to store some of it in the basement. Now, I got halfway down the basement steps when the door slammed shut and the light turned off. And I just about screamed the whole house down. As you can imagine, I raced to the top of the stairs and I couldn't open the door. So of course I was absolutely freaking out this time because it was pitch black and I couldn't see what had happened. I did eventually get out, thankfully, but not before bringing every resident of the house running down to see what happened because it sounded like I was being murdered. When I got out, what had actually happened was that there was a big metal tabletop or something against the far wall in front of the door that had hit the door, and somehow a metal latch on the door had, when the door slammed shut, hit the light switch. So the action of this thing falling against the door had not only shut me in and locked me in because it was heavy as well, it was jamming the door shut, it had also managed to hit the light switch in the process and turn the light off and leave me in pitch darkness. So there is a sort of an explanation for what happened there, but what I couldn't ever figure out was that the basement wasn't off limits or anything. People did go in and out of there, and this metal tabletop was firmly wedged. So I don't know what caused that to fall. I didn't hit it on the way down. I wasn't carrying anything big to dislodge it. So I don't know what caused that to fall against the door in the way it did.
Tipped from the top, did it? So that it sort of had to pass through its centre of gravity to go, rather than sliding out from the bottom.
It didn't slide from the bottom. It was propped up against the door, against the wall, at an angle, and tipped from the top against the door.
That's weird.
Yeah, it was very weird. And obviously, even if it wasn't paranormal, it was really scary to be stuck in a pitch dark basement and then couldn't get out.
I can imagine.
I didn't go down there very often after that.
I never had a problem with the basement.
Did you not? Oh.
No. Well, you remember I used to brew beer and I used to keep it down there, and I was up and down a lot and never had any problem with it.
I honestly didn't even like walking past the basement door, but obviously that experience did colour my opinion somewhat, as you can imagine.
Fair enough. Yeah. Now, whilst I didn't have any experiences myself in the basement, Rob did mention seeing the sort of skittery legs.
Yes.
That was something I experienced. I think we both experienced.
Yeah, that was quite a common thing for me to see. These sort of black, skittery, quick darting shadows.
It's almost... You'd see them, and as soon as you saw them, it was like they'd noticed you'd see them and they were bolting out of the way.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there was a few, because we saw it so often, I'm sure there was a few times it was just your eyes failing to adjust or things like that, but there was a lot of times when it blatantly wasn't.
And there was a lot of times it looked, I don't really know how to explain it other than leggy. It's what Rob was talking about with these sort of long, skittery, spidery legs.
Yeah, spidery is quite a good way of explaining it. They were just... It sent shivers down your spine. It was very...
unnatural.
Yeah, definitely unnatural. And we used to see those very regularly. And we even had an instance, it wasn't quite the same thing. I'd seen a sort of black mass, like the size of a tennis ball. And it had darted across from the bottom of the... We were sat in the kitchen, looking down the hallway, and it darted across from the bottom of the stairs into the living room. Now, any other time, I'd have just assumed that it was just a dark spot on your, because you've got a blind spot in front of your eyes. I'd have assumed it was that, or I'd just turned quickly and it was a sort of effect from moving. But the cat chased it.
And we both watched the cat chase it as we saw it move across the hallway.
Yeah, we literally were both. Did you just see that?
Yeah.
And the cat bolted down the hallway after it, got to the living room and just stopped.
But let me clarify, this wasn't on the floor level, so this wasn't like a small animal, it wasn't a mouse or anything like that. This was sort of in the air.
Yeah. It was sort of chest height, I think. So you're talking
right.
4 or 5 feet in the air. And it wasn't a bird or a bat or anything.
No, it quite obviously wasn't an animal.
It was completely round, with a sort of fuzzy outline, very dark in the middle.
Very dense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just sort of got fuzzy around the edges. I've never seen anything like it before or since.
No, me neither. Oh, do you know what? This is thoroughly freaking me out, sitting here recounting these tales. So having thoroughly freaked ourselves out, I think it might be time for a story. And this one is from Jessica in Toronto. I had just turned 26, and my boyfriend John and I were settling into our brand new apartment on the top floor of a 21-storey building, across from the small mall where he and I both worked. At the time, he was working nights at the grocery store. One night, near the end of February, I was home by myself, John having just left for his shift. I was sitting on the couch, cup of tea in hand, our dachshund Spencer Bruce snuggled up beside me. Our 2 cats, Vladimir and Spooks, were cuddled up together on the cat tree beside the television, which I was lazily watching for a bit before heading to bed. Around 10 p.m, I felt Spencer Bruce go tense beside me. He began to growl threateningly, which was very out of character for him. I looked over at him, and the fur on his back was standing up, almost like he had a long mohawk, from his neck to the start of his tail. "What's the matter, babe?" I asked. I thought maybe he'd heard someone out in the hallway. Our apartment was right across from the elevators, so we would often hear people walking past our door or talking in the hallway while they waited for an elevator. But even when this did happen, he never reacted this harshly. As if in reply, Spencer hopped down from the couch and trotted intently over to the front door, which I could see from where I was sitting on the couch. He stopped his growling, but just stood there, staring at the door. I got up, teacup in hand, and shuffled over to the front door to peek out of the peephole. There was no one there that I could see. As far as I knew, the apartments to either side of ours were vacant, but I figured maybe the neighbours across the hall had come home, and I'd just missed them entering their apartment. I was halfway back to the couch when the loudest bang I'd ever heard echoed through the apartment. It sounded like someone had used a battering ram against the front door. Many things then happened at once. I screamed and dropped my tea, cup shattering on the laminate floor. The cat sprang off the cat tree so violently that it fell over, almost bringing the TV down with it as they tore off into the bedroom, and Spencer started barking and snarling like a beast possessed. I ran back to the front door, heart pounding, with Spencer at my heels, and opened it. There was no one in the hallway. Spencer ran out of the apartment. He did a quick lap of the hallway and returned to the door, seemingly confused that there was no one there. His fur was still standing on end, and when we shut the door and made our way back to the couch, he sat with his front legs on the arm, intently looking out of the door. I have quite severe anxiety disorder, so by this time I was pretty worked up and in the beginning stages of a panic attack. I took my medication cleaned up the mess of tea in the living room, and called my mum. I told her everything that had happened. She scolded me for opening the door. "Jessica, Elizabeth, what if it was a gang of murderers?" But she was able to calm me down in a way that only a mum can. I must have fallen asleep while talking to her, because I was jolted awake sometime later by another deafening bang on the front door, and Spencer once again going nuts. I checked my phone. It was just after 1 in the morning. Heart in my throat, I picked him up and quickly put him in the bedroom before returning to the door. This time I had no intention of opening the door, but when I looked through the peephole again, I saw my elderly neighbours poking their heads out into the hallway. I opened the door and the man asked, "Did you hear it too?" We were just about to go to bed. I thought the entire door was going to come down. "Mine too," I told him, then asked, "Did you hear it before?" "We only just got home," the wife said, shaking her head. "My goodness, I don't know if I'll be able to sleep now." We said our goodnights and I closed the door, locked and bolted it before letting Spencer and the cats out of the bedroom and returning to the couch. I texted John, even though I knew he wouldn't receive it until he finished his shift. "Am never sleeping again. Will explain if I make it through the night." It took everything I had in me not to break down and call my mum again. I didn't have to work the next day, so I spent the whole night watching comedies on Netflix. Spencer didn't make a peep when I heard John outside the door come morning. I unbolted the door so he could get in, and when he asked what on earth the text message was about, I launched into my harrowing tale from the night before. He's sure it was just teenagers on our floor being idiots, banging on the doors and then running to the end of the hall and hiding in the small alcove by the door to the stairs. After getting a few hours of sleep, I texted our friends, who lived 4 floors down, to see if they'd experienced anything weird the night before. They hadn't. We lived in that apartment for the next 4 years without further incident.
And thank you to Jessica for that amazingly spooky story. And coincidentally, we actually received that at around about the same time that we had our own spooky door-knocking experience.
We did. We do seem to often have a kind of spooky synchronicity with our listeners. It's quite interesting. And also, Jessica, I wanted to say I do empathise. I have anxiety disorder myself, so I can imagine the effect that had on you. And I know only too well, it doesn't even have to be a ghost. It can quite as easily be just the postman knocking on the door that sets off a panic attack.
Or me climbing the stairs while you're listening to spooky podcasts.
Oh, don't. I was listening to Ghosts in the Burbs and I had my headphones in, so I didn't hear Fitz coming up the stairs. And I was just reaching the scary climax of the story when he opened the door and I just about hit the ceiling. And I've not quite forgiven him for that yet. But the other point in this story I wanted to address was the fact that Jess's boyfriend said he thought it might have just been teenagers playing around. But I did ask her, her dog obviously rushed straight out onto the landing, and I thought if that had happened and there was teenagers hiding there, surely the dog would have gone straight to them. And she said, yes, that's absolutely right, and now thank you very much, she's thoroughly freaked out all over again. Sorry, Jessica.
Whilst we're still on the subject of knocks, bangs and strange noises, that's something else that we experienced at our haunted house.
Quite regularly, in fact. Banging and crashing, I think, is more the order of the day than knocks and bangs.
Yeah, even that barely does it justice. There was one room in the house that one of our other housemates stayed in, and it sounded at times like the Hulk was in there throwing bookcases around.
It did sound like somebody was trashing his room, and I have to point out, he wasn't in it at these times.
And I even checked once.
Yeah, I quite clearly.
And only once.
Yeah, I quite clearly remember you plucking up the courage to go up there, because honestly, we knew we were in the house alone, just the two of us, and we thought somebody had broken in, really, and was just going through their room. It was so loud, and it made the ceiling shake. And you went up there with great trepidation, expecting to basically come across a burglar, and there was just nothing, was there?
No, not a thing. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was touched. It just looked as it normally did, and the noises stopped as I was climbing the stairs.
Yeah, I have to say I didn't go up with you.
No, it was absolutely terrible. It was so terrifying that sometimes when it happened, we just had to go out.
Yeah, we had to leave on a number of occasions, because although it was a shared house, there were obviously times of the day when most of us were out. There was, we did have neighbours, but you didn't really have the noise bleed through like that. And I mean, it was the room where a lot of the activity seemed to be focused was directly above the kitchen. And that's when we tended to notice it most, because we'd be sitting in the kitchen, having coffee or a meal or something, and you could hear this absolute ruckus going on above us. It sounded like somebody was up there throwing boxes, like moving boxes full of stuff and shoving them so they flew across the floor, making this awful like banging and then dragging sounds. And we'd also have the cats downstairs with us.
Yeah.
And on quite a number of occasions, we had 4 cats, I think, at that time. And all the cats would be basically sat around us, looking up at the ceiling above them as it was sort of shaking with this noise. And they could clearly hear it as well. They knew that there was something wrong, and they were just as frightened as we were. And we did have to leave sometimes because it just got so intense.
Yeah, like Lil was saying about the transfer of noise as well, that it was a sort of little extension out of the back of the house. So while it was a terrace, it was only connected to one of the neighbouring houses.
Yeah.
There was a gap where the garden was on the other side, and the side where it was connected was a little old lady who was a music teacher.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like she was going to be throwing stuff around.
No.
Plus, you could hear whenever her door opened and closed. And I think that day we'd got the day off work, and we hadn't heard anyone come in or out, so
no,
it's not like she was having a ruckus with a dissatisfied student.
No, we'd occasionally hear music coming from next door, and that would be her. But yeah, this sounded like somebody throwing around furniture, which I don't think she could have done anyway.
And I don't think the sound would have transferred as loudly as it had, or would have made our ceiling shake.
No, this is it. I mean, it really was causing a physical vibration, and I just don't think that would be possible to come through from next door.
And it wasn't just bangs and crashes. There were voices too.
There was. In fact, before I'd even moved in the house, Rob was already living there, and I stayed over one night and slept on the sofa. And just as I was sort of settling in for the night, a little bit wary because I'd heard the recording in the basement, I heard somebody shout my name right in my ear. There was nobody else around, and it was my full name as well, which nobody calls me, especially not any of the guys in the house, but, well, no, not even my mum really calls me my full name. Right in my ear, and I've never experienced anything like that. It was so clear and so loud. But I don't think that was quite as terrifying as the voice you heard, Fitz.
Yeah, mine was opposite. Well, I say opposite. Yours was a shout. Mine was just a whisper in my ear.
Which is, I think, much creepier.
Yeah, I was in our room. I think I was sat at the computer doing something or other. You'd gone for band practice.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. I was going to pop to the shop or something. I wanted to go out for something. And as I got out of my chair and walked towards the door, I just heard something whisper in my ear, "No."
Oh, God.
And I froze.
As you would.
And then I went over to the far side of the room on our bed and sat there for a couple of minutes thinking, that's terrifying. I'd really like to escape, but it means I have to go past the place where something said no. So I then turned on the television, turned up the volume really, really loud, and sat there for about half an hour. And I tried it again, and same thing. I was like, right, I'll turn everything off and go out. Half an hour's passed, I should be fine. Again, got near the door. No.
Oh my God.
So yeah, I put headphones on, I put the telly on, I put the computer, I put anything that would make noise on, and just sat there and waited until you got home.
And I remember getting home and you were terrified. And I just wondered what on earth was wrong, because I literally got got upstairs, and you were like, I'm so glad you're home. I've never been so glad to see anybody in my life. And you were white as a sheet. And I was just like, what on earth happened? And that's just, it's so sinister.
It's weird though, because, you'd have thought just something saying no, creepy as it is, wouldn't prevent you from physically leaving.
Well, I think it would me.
Normally I'd have thought that would just have encouraged me to run.
But you had to go through the doorway where whatever it was that was whispering at you clearly was.
Yeah, it was almost like it sort of turned a switch in my brain that just said you cannot physically leave this room.
But you know what? It's easy to say this now because we're not in that house anymore. But as sinister as it sounds, could it have been something actually looking out for you? Well, I don't know. Maybe there was a reason that it needed you to stay in the room. Maybe it was a protection thing. I just don't know.
I don't suppose we'll ever know.
No.
One of those, you can't tell that it hasn't happened because it hadn't happened.
Let's not go down that rabbit hole. Okay, I think it's nearly time for another story. But just before we do that, I think we'll have another really quite terrifying clip about one of Rob's experiences.
One of the main things that happened to me that nobody else experienced that I know of, I had some really strange dreams while I was there, and one particular dream, I just dreamt that I was spinning around, and when I woke up from the dream, I was at the bottom of my bed, on my back, just at the end of a spin.
Oh!
And yeah.
That's horrible.
That is awful.
It only happened once, but that absolutely happened. I can really clearly remember waking up and just being like, and panicking. I may have swore a few times.
Yeah, I can imagine you did. I had no idea. That's really terrifying.
That's quite a freaky incident there from Rob. He did mention later on that while he was pretty freaked out by it, he didn't feel any malice behind it.
Yeah, he said although it was really disturbing, he didn't feel like anything was really trying to harm him, and more that it was just a mischievous spirit. I don't think that would have brought me much comfort in the same situation, but there we go. But I think we're going to go to our next story now, and this is a story about a haunted school from Scott Weatherly.
When I was younger, I attended Cowden Court Secondary School in Coventry. The school was made up of the usual school buildings, each a warren of classrooms and corridors. However, it also had another building attached, one that was much older than the school. It's a grand mid-Victorian house that was built and owned by George Singer, owner of Singer Cycles. It being a house in a school, it was obviously called the Old House, and was home to the school library and the English department. As you can imagine, there was a wealth of legends and stories about the house and the grounds, all of which were collected into a book by a former English teacher, along with details of the family and how the building was turned into a school. So the history and truth were readily available for any student that wanted to read about it. But where's the fun in that? I won't roll out all the tall tales here, but there are two that are pertinent to my story. The first is that the Singer family had several young children, and that they had their bedrooms and nursery in the rooms that would later become the English classrooms on the first floor of the building. Students would often hear about teachers reporting hearing giggling as they were locking up at night, or how small items would be moved or go missing from the rooms. On one occasion, decorators explained that the handprints in the paint on a wall appeared overnight and could not have been a student. Nothing evil, just playful. Although it is odd, as there were never any stories of children dying in the house, all the Singer children grew to live full lives, one of my teachers would often comment that it was a playful energy that had been absorbed by the house and manifested in mischievous ways. The second is less playful. The legend tells that the family hired a nanny, Ermine, to look after the younger children. However, while working at the house, she started an affair with the eldest son. This, of course, would not be permitted by the family. When they were found out, a massive row erupted, and during the argument, Ermine was pushed away from the son, lost her footing, and fell over the balcony from the first floor to the hardwood floors of the entrance hall below. She was killed instantly, her blood leaving a stain in the old wood floor that would return again and again, no matter how many times or how deep it was cleaned or sanded. Students and faculty alike would report seeing the sad nanny wandering the house or grounds. However, she never actually interacted with anyone, preferring to disappear as soon as she realised she had been spotted. This preamble is to provide context to my small little slice of the supernatural. I was about to start Year 9, my third year at the school, and my sister Lauren was about to join the school. So this story takes place in late August 1995. To welcome new students, the school had an open evening towards the end of the summer holidays for new students to have a look round and meet some of the staff. My parents took the opportunity to catch up with some of the other parents, while I and a friend of mine, Stuart Bentley, agreed to show my sister round. After a short while, we ended up in the old house. I had some work on the wall of a classroom that I wanted to show off, so we went to the English classrooms. It was notably deserted in the building, as most staff and parents had gathered in the main hall to close out the evening. Walking down the short corridor, there was a single classroom on either side, and at the end a fire escape door that could only be opened from the inside and led to an external staircase that had been added to the building. The staircase was caged in and had a door at the bottom that could only be opened from the building side. The idea, of course, to prevent students from using the fire escape to get to class or just mess around out of sight. Being an old building, the correct use of the staircase for emergency was drilled into old students. We entered one of the rooms and instantly my younger sister asked, "Did you hear that laugh?" Knowing the tales, Stuart and I looked at each other and smirked. Lauren was less amused and wanted to leave. Laughing it off, we all started to head back up the corridor. We hadn't taken more than a couple of steps when my sister stumbled and turned on Stuart and I. "Stop pushing me," she stated. Neither of us had touched her, but she was adamant that she had been shoved. Suddenly, and without missing a beat, the heavy fire escape door at the end of the corridor started to shake violently in its frame. The banging was thunderous to us in that moment, and we did the only thing three intrepid young people should do. We ran as fast as we could to get out of there. Standing outside the old house in the fading evening light, I at least felt better, despite my pounding heart. I don't know whether to call it mischief or anger, but I'm sure there was someone or something in that old house that wanted to give us a scare. Stuart and I shared the story with several members of staff when we returned to school in September. I'm not sure how many of them believed us, but I am sure a couple would have done. I continued my time at Cowden without any further supernatural instances. I cannot speak, however, for the hundreds of other students, teachers and staff that have studied and worked in that old house. I'm sure there are many other tales to tell.
Thank you so much to Scott for that wonderfully creepy story, just perfect for a Halloween night.
Yeah, as if old school buildings weren't creepy enough as it is.
That's very true. Well, Scott's actually a fellow podcaster and host of 20th Century Geek, a podcast all about the pop culture of the 20th century. And recently we were lucky enough to be invited on his show to talk about the most famous haunted house of all, Amityville.
We had a fantastic time speaking to Scott about one of the world's most infamous hauntings, and I must admit I'm kind of looking forward to hearing the episode myself.
Oh, I am. I'm excited.
It's going to be available on the 8th of November, and if you can't wait that long, we can recommend checking out his episode on the controversial BBC programme Ghostwatch.
Which I remember watching in the 90s from behind my hands. I was so scared.
It's available on pretty much all the usual podcast platforms and also at www.20thcenturygeek.com, and I'll be putting a link in the description.
Well, Amityville may be the most infamous haunted house, but we do still have a few tales to tell from our own. And talking about the cats earlier reminded me of an incident I'd actually totally forgotten about till just now. Our room was on the top floor of the 3-storey house, and next to us was an empty room nobody lived in. We kept the door shut to this room because it kind of had a lot of junk in and we didn't want the cats going in there and rootling around. Well, one day we came home from work and I could hear a mewling from behind the door to this empty room, and the scratching. That was obviously an animal in there in distress wanting to get out. So I let the poor cat out, wondering how on earth she got in there in the first place because we kept the door latched shut. But when I went in, the heavy double glazed window was pushed wide open, and I just don't know how it could have opened. There hadn't been anybody up there. There was nobody living in that room. There was absolutely no way the cat could have opened that window. It was a latching mechanism that really took quite a lot of effort to get in and out of place, and even once it was unlatched, the window was heavy and it needed a good push to open it.
Yeah, and the windows were something we were really careful about because obviously we lived on the 3rd floor, we were next to a busy road. We were really careful about making sure that all the windows were closed, that the doors were shut. Everybody had to check their feet before leaving the house so that they didn't have a cat sneak out with them.
Yeah, these were house cats. We were quite careful about keeping them in, and in fact the window that we had in our room we covered in netting just to make sure that they couldn't get out. So all the residents were very well drilled about keeping the windows shut.
Not that they've had any reason to come up to the room on our floor.
And certainly not to open the window, no. So that was very strange. The other main thing that happened in that house, obviously quite a lot of people saw the apparition of this little girl. And I only saw her very fleetingly, but I saw a couple of times another different apparition. And this is the clearest apparition I have ever seen. The first time I saw him, I was sitting in our room against the back wall facing the door. And as I looked up, I just saw somebody poke their head round the door. Now, this wasn't unusual in itself. We tended to leave our door open and our housemates did sort of nip in and out. But it was nobody that I recognised. It was a complete stranger. And the other thing was, this is the only time I've seen an apparition with such clear facial features I could really see the expression. And this guy was just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. The look he gave me was, "What are you doing in my room?" It was so bizarre. It was more like a time slip or something than an apparition.
I think this is like a common thing because there's a lot of experiences that people have. But what's the most common thing you hear on EVPs? Like, get out. Who's,
Or who's there?
Yeah.
Help me. All the things you'd say if you came across somebody unexpectedly in your house.
Yeah, exactly. It's weird.
That was exactly the vibe I got. I thought it was a person to start with until I ran out there and obviously there was nobody around. But yeah, the thing that floored me and sort of froze me for a couple of seconds was just this look. Like, what are you doing in my room? I've never seen anything else like it. It really freaked me out. And he was really clear. It was a young guy in his 20s and he had short brown hair, which quite easily excluded all of our housemates because all the guys had long hair and all the girls had bright pink hair. So it wasn't anybody that I knew. But the even more interesting thing was that I saw him again, because sometimes, we know our eyes see what we expect to see. You make faces, it's this whole pareidolia thing. But the fact that I saw this guy quite clearly with the same facial features, it was the same young man in his 20s with the short dark hair again. And this isn't anybody I knew. This wasn't a face I recognised that could be pulled from my memory to sort of fill in a visual blank. The second time it happened, I was going up the final flight of stairs to our room, and I saw somebody come down the stairs, and I just stepped to the side, as you would, because I thought, well, there's not enough room for us to pass, I'm going to crash into him. So I stepped to the side, I saw him come round the corner of the stairs, saw that it was the same guy, saw the facial features, and then he just wasn't there. And I was just left going, obviously I'd stepped out of the way for nothing.
Mm.
It was very strange, but in that moment I recognised him. I recognised his face. That's never happened before. It was so strange.
It's a weird thing about that house that while there's so many common themes, we each also had our own separate odd experience.
Yeah, because nobody else, to my knowledge, saw this guy.
No, like Rob and I both saw the little girl. You and Rob had issues in the basement, but
Which
I
you
didn't. Got shouted at in the living room, and I didn't, although I think other people did.
Mm.
And you were the only person, as far as I'm aware, that saw this man. I was the only person, as far as I'm aware, that had whispering in my ear.
Yeah.
So we each kind of had a different personal experience, but there was also a sort of
Common theme.
experience as
Yeah,
well.
there were
really
a lot
strange.
that crossed over that we shared.
Mm. Talking of common experiences, it was quite common for our guests to experience something paranormal as well.
So during the time we were in the house, we obviously had visitors, and some of them had some pretty strange experiences as well.
The main one I can remember was a friend of mine who he just stayed over for one night and then he didn't come back again. And
We had one of those as well.
Yeah. He woke up to a dog barking, and it was apparently just stood on his chest, just barking in his face.
Oh my god.
And he pretty much just got up and left.
I don't really blame him. We had a friend of yours came over, didn't we?
Yep.
And we never saw him again either.
No, we were just sat in the living room chatting, and all of a sudden he went pale, almost green.
I've never seen anybody turn colour that quickly, and I've never seen anybody turn that shade of pale that has a slightly green tinge to it. That was the first and last time.
Literally, he went completely silent, face drained of all colour and slightly green. And I think we just turned around to him and said, you've just seen it, haven't you?
Yeah.
And he just nodded slowly.
And said, how did you know? He did. I clocked him doing the double take. He saw it, turned back and looked immediately back, and then that's when the colour drained. But yeah, poor man. We literally haven't even heard from him since. Let alone, it wasn't just that he didn't come back to the house. No. He just vanished.
Must have changed his phone. I think he even moved house. So.
Oh no! We broke him.
Yes, it did tend to be that once people had been round once, they wouldn't come back for a second try.
Mm-hmm.
We've got one more story coming up from Fraser about our spooky house, but before we get into that, we've got a story from Kira in Glasgow.
During my last year at university, I worked in a very trendy cocktail bar in Merchant Square in Glasgow. The Merchant Square sits in the heart of the Merchant City area. Today, it's a hive of bars and restaurants, but back in the day, it was, as the name suggests, a bustling market. The square is an odd building. It's an indoor courtyard with several bars and restaurants making up the walls of the square. The backs of the restaurants all face into one another and make up the space that used to house the huge market area. The inside of these bars and restaurants are all very trendy and modern, but once you're round the back in the staff area, things look much different, or at least they did then. The basement area of the bar where I worked always gave me the creeps. It had a really heavy, oppressive atmosphere, and oftentimes, when I was climbing back up the stairs with a huge plastic tray full of crockery, I'd be sure I could feel someone brushing past me, or someone following close behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand on end, and I'd rush to get out of the bowels of the bar as quickly as my little legs would carry me. The longer I worked there, the more shifts I would do on the downstairs cocktail bar. Working in the bar was great fun, and I really enjoyed it, especially on the weekends when the DJ would be in and the tunes would be banging. The only part of my job that I really hated was going down to the cellar to replenish the wine stocks. Our cellars were housed in the areas under the fruit market, where the tunnels were. It's said there is a warren of tunnels under there, and you can actually walk from one bar to the other underneath the cobblestone courtyard. I'll have to take the word of others on this, as I've never hung around long enough to find out. I would often run down as quickly as I could into the chilly depths of the cellar, all the while being sure something was watching me from the shadows. I'd grab whatever I was down there for and sprint straight back up the stairs. On several occasions, I heard whispering, door slamming, and felt freezing cold drafts. All more or less explainable in cellar conditions like that, but I became so afraid of the cellar that I would try to avoid going down there whenever I could manage it, and often asked some of the guys to come with me and help, so I wasn't on my own. Once I was sent down to retrieve a few cases of red wine for a party that was going on in the function suite. I asked my fellow barman Scott to come with me, so that I didn't have to make several trips, for obvious reasons. He said he would. He was just going to take some dishes back to the kitchen and would get me down there. I agreed and began to head to the back of the restaurant and down the back stairs. I soon heard Scott clumping down the metal steps behind me, and we made our way down to the cellar. Thankfully, the wine wasn't too far in, just a couple of sets of doors to go through to get to the 6-pack boxes of Cabernet Sauvignon. Scott was following really close behind me, and I pushed through both sets of doors, holding the door open for him to follow behind me without really looking back. I was so intent on grabbing the boxes and getting the hell out of there. When we reached the wine stocks, I spotted the Cabernet Sauvignon and turned to ask Scott if he could manage 2 at a time back up the stairs, or if we should use the little service lift instead. I stopped dead. Scott wasn't there. There was no one behind me, in front of me, anywhere around me in the cellar. I stood there for a second, completely dumbfounded and confused, because I knew I'd seen him. It wasn't until my brain began to race that I realised I hadn't actually looked behind me. I'd seen him out of the corner of my eye and just assumed he was following me, but not a physical soul had actually been there. It had been so real I hadn't questioned it at all. I'd felt the vibration of every single one of his footsteps as we descended the metal staircase. I'd heard his breathing and huffing as we trotted down the stairs together. It hadn't been real. There had been no one there. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran as fast as I could out of that freezing cold space, running straight through the 2 sets of doors back towards the safety of the restaurant, almost ploughing headlong into Scott, who was only halfway down the 2nd flight of stairs to join me by this time. He could tell by the expression and colour on my face that whatever had happened, it had scared the complete and utter hell out of me. I was so shaken I could barely breathe and asked to leave. I had to get out of that horrible building. It was the last time I ever went down to that cellar, and I didn't stay there long after that. I took a job in a call centre soon afterwards just to get away from the place, and I'm glad I did. The memory of the presence behind me still gives me the chills.
Well, it certainly appears as if spooky basements is the theme of today's episode.
Indeed.
Thank you so much to Kira in Glasgow for that story. Kira was actually kind enough to send in another story, and we'll be bringing that to you in another episode.
Thank you so much to everybody that shared their stories on today's episode. As you know, they really are the heart of our show, and as ever, if you've got a story you'd like to share, please get in touch through our website at knockonceforyes.com. And also, I hate to be the one to bring up the C word, but we are starting to think about our Christmas episode. So if anybody has any festive or maybe heartwarming stories, possibly a hilarious paranormal blooper to share on our festive episode, please start getting those in now if you can. And we also thought we'd up the ante somewhat this year on the Knock Once for Yes annual Christmas quiz by asking the listeners to send in their quiz questions for us.
If you'd like to send in a quiz question, then please send it to contact@knockonceforyes.com. And if it's a question for me, put Quiz Fitz in the subject line. And if it's a question for Lil, put Quiz Lil in the subject line.
That way we won't cheat and look at the answers. Now we've just got one more, I would say slightly cautionary tale from our very haunted house. And Denise from History Goes Bump, if you're listening, this is a very good example of why you should not tempt the spirits. This is what happened to Fraser.
Just to paint a picture, you just moved in. I'd heard a lot of stuff about some of the more intense experiences that people were having in this house.
Yeah.
And I basically, we were in your room specifically, called it out.
Yeah, he pretty much stood there and said, well, I haven't had anything happen to me.
I think it was more like, what are you all scared about? It's not like anything like this would even be scary, bring it on, try and scare me.
What were you thinking?
It was really dumb. But, without even missing a beat, immediately upon me saying this, and just the positioning, the three of you were standing outside of the room in the corridor. I was the only person in the room with my back to the wall facing you, making this grand proclamation. And as soon as the words had left my mouth, this big metal lantern, was it? It was where you put a candle in.
There was a bunch of stuff.
I swear it was this little metal lantern thing that you put a candle in, unhooked itself from its hook and smashed loudly against the ground behind me, scaring me so much that I managed to practically dissipate out of the room.
Well, in doing so, it also hit, there was a cabinet there with lots of other stuff on it,
right,
so it smashed into
It made
all the other stuff as well.
Big
So
old
it made
noise,
a big noise
is what we're saying. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen Scooby-Doo, but I basically jumped into Lil's arms,
You did. And it wasn't a short distance either, because there was 5-6 foot of landing between where you were standing and where I was standing, and I've never seen anybody do that kind of a long jump into my arms before.
It was literally the blink of an eye.
Well, I don't even know how you did it.
Never seen anyone have such a comic book reaction to something scary. To be honest, I have never been so savagely cut down so fast in my entire life.
Well, you kind of asked.
Yeah, there was some delicious words I ate immediately.
Yeah, you didn't do that again.
Said them. No, I did not. That was the last time I provoked that house.
Yep.
Absolutely.
That's just about all we've got time for this episode.
But if you can't get enough of the paranormal this Halloween season, we can help you out with a few recommendations. We love the Until Dawn podcast, a husband and wife team talking about the peculiar, haunted and unexplainable. And they don't just talk about it, they investigate it as well. They recently did an episode on Haunted Disney, which was very cool. You can find them on pretty much all the podcast platforms. Just search for Until Dawn.
We can also recommend Stranger Than, another paranormal banter podcast featuring stories not just of hauntings, but unsolved mysteries and other misunderstood phenomena and creepy happenings. Do be warned though, not safe for work.
And if that's still not enough spook for you, our friend and author Karen Pomerantz has released a short horror story in ebook format just in time for Halloween. So if you fancy reading a grisly tale of horror that's just for adults, The Cost of Living will be available in most ebook stores such as Apple iBooks, Kobo, Amazon or Barnes & Noble, and in a lot of these places it will be available for free. Just search The Cost of Living.
That really is all we've got time for this episode, and we just want to say a huge thank you to all our listeners and supporters for our very first year of Knock Once for Yes. We hope you've enjoyed it, we hope you carry on enjoying it, and that you will join us for future episodes.
Just for a little change, I think we're going to have a snippet of Starforger to play us out today. So if you like what you hear, you can go and check out Starforger on Bandcamp. Happy Halloween, everyone.